Pues buenas tardes, es un gran honor para mí presentarles a ustedes a Tim Whitmarsh de la Universidad de Cambridge. Tim es ahorita profesor visitante en la Universidad de Chicago, también es Leventhise Professor in Ancient Greek Culture en la Universidad de Cambridge, es asociado del St. John's College en Cambridge, investigador asociado en la Universidad de Pretoria, es miembro honorario de Corpus Christi, el Centro de Estudios de la Antigüedad Romana y Griega de la Universidad de Oxford, y bueno, imparte distintos cursos. En este momento está impartiendo un curso sobre, digamos, lecturas de la Odisea en Lisias, Dion Crisóstomo, Aquiles Tacio, Esquilo, Herodoto y Longo. Y como muchos de ustedes también sabrán, es autor de numerosos libros, todos ellos un parteaguas en la manera en la que estudiamos a la literatura griega y en particular a la literatura griega escrita durante el Imperio Romano. Por mencionar algunos que están aquí, es Narrative and Identity in the Ancient Greek Novel, Returning Romance, que fue el ganador del premio Goodwin en el 2014. También The Romance Between Greece and the East, publicado por Cambridge en el 2013. Otro libro muy interesante, quizá fundamental también para todos nosotros, sea Battling the Gods, Atheism in the Ancient World, un estudio exhaustivo y el primero de su tipo, me parece, sobre, digamos, actitudes ateas en la antigüedad. También tiene este excelente título, ¿verdad? Dirty Love, The Genealogy of the Greek Novel, un estudio también sobre Aquiles Tacio, Leucippe y Clitofón, los libros 1 y 2. Y bueno, nada más, paso con Tim un segundo. No vamos a tener tiempo para preguntas, pero si por favor tienen preguntas, levanten este papel en donde pueden escribir su pregunta y se le pasará a Tim después. Sin más preámbulos, pues, muchas gracias, Tim, por tenerte aquí, es un honor. Y le damos la bienvenida a tu conferencia, The Bastards of Cynosarges and the Invention of Virtue.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to the organisers for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here. And we have a pointer. Excellent. Great. Thank you very much. Very exciting. It's also a great honour to follow Professor Bernabé, and very appropriate, actually, that my paper will follow his, because his paper was about pre-Socratics, and I'm going to be talking about post-Socratics. That's to say, people that were dealing with the legacy of Socrates, in particular, Plato and Antisthenes. But I want to begin with a reflection on the state of the field at the moment, in particularly literary and cultural studies and classical antiquity. Just a quick reflection, because it seems to me that there's something stirring in classical literature at the moment, something I haven't really sensed since my graduate days, when people were rather belatedly getting very excited about post-structuralism, the influence of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida and people. The new mood might be understood as a rejection of post-structuralism. Post-structuralism tends to focus on the abstract, on the cerebral, the deferred, the problematic, the elliptical. And people now are talking much more in terms of the sensory, the embodied, the object-orientated. People are talking about reality in a much more strong, concrete way. Instead of the thinness of reality, they're talking about, this joke may not come across very well, but the thinginess, the fact that reality is made out of things, solid objects. That seems to be much more the fashion of contemporary classical scholarship. I'm going to refer to this movement, just in passing, just because it needs a name, as neo-realism, a term that I'm borrowing from post-war Italian cinema, when people like, eventually people like Pier Paolo Pasolini were emphasizing that reality had its own powerful force itself. And Pasolini spoke of heretical empiricism. And I think that captures something of the mood that we see in classical studies at the moment, a reclaiming of the real and the tangible, the touchable nature of reality, but not just in a way of saying, okay, there were real things in antiquity, but using this in a heretical way to try and re-establish new boundaries and new ways of understanding classical antiquity. So seeing the world realistically, according to this new way of thinking, comes to be a sort of heretical act. Now, this paper is centrally about Plato, the founding father of ancient philosophical anti-realism, if you like, and his rival Antisthenes. For Plato, of course, what most people call the real world is simply an illusion, a thin fabric knitted together from unexamined assumptions, from what Plato calls doxa, belief or opinion. Plato was, as I say, the anti-realist par excellence. But Plato did live in the real world. My aim in this paper is to put him back in that real world and think about what Plato's real world, the intractable stones and hardness of reality that surrounded Plato's world, what that meant for Plato and how that shaped his thought world. Now let's take, for example, passage 1 on the handout to start with. You've got a handout there. You've got one? Okay, so I'll take this one. Okay, so this is from Plato's Lysis, and it's right at the beginning, and it tells us about Socrates taking a walk through real space in the city of Athens, from the academy to the Lyceum. I was making my way, Socrates says, from the academy straight to the Lyceum by the road outside the town wall, just under the wall, when I reached the little gate that leads to the spring of Panops. And I chanced there upon Hippothales, son of Hieronymus, and Ctesippus of Paeania, and some other youths with him, and so forth. And what we have here is a recognizable walk in real space. We know about this little gate that leads to the spring of Panops, and we know also about the wrestling school that Socrates ends up in here, the wrestling school known as the Taureum. Now, when I say this is real space, I don't necessarily mean that Socrates or Plato is depicting it in an accurate or unmediated way. There's been lots of discussion of this particular passage, in fact, showing that the way in which Plato represents the space of Athens here is manipulated, as you would expect. Plato is a literary crafting author. He's somebody who doesn't just mimetically depict reality, he uses it for his own effects. Nevertheless, reality has its own agency too. Every spring, every gate, every river exerts its pull on Plato's story. If we know where these places are in real space, that shapes the way in which we read a passage like this. So if we really want to turn the lens of heretical empiricism back onto Plato's text, we'd better take these landmarks, these physical landmarks, seriously, and not just as literary decor or as features within a landscape that is entirely of Plato's own design. We need to remember that this philosophy was conducted in and intended to be read about in the context of the city of Athens itself. Now, Socrates, as far as we know, tended to teach in wrestling grounds, in palaistrae. His philosophical successors, however, graduated to the city's public gymnasia, and that will be my topic today. What was it like to leave the city walls of Athens and to go to study with Plato in the academy, or with Aristotle in the Lyceum? Or indeed to visit the now lesser-known philosopher Antisthenes in the now lesser-known gymnasium of the Cynosarges, which has given me the title of my paper. These three spaces, the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Cynosarges, were the city's three main gymnasia, and each of those was associated with the training of the mind as well as the training of the body. It is indeed from the Academy to the Lyceum, these two gymnasia outside the city walls, that Socrates has been walking in the prologue to the Lysis, around the northern perimeter of the city wall, although at the time of the dramatic setting of the dialogue, they were not yet sites of philosophy. I will in fact have little to say about the Lyceum. It's not really part of my story. It's rather later on in the story. I'm more interested in the relationship between Plato's Academy and Antisthenes' Cynosarges, both of which philosophical complexes were, in a sense, rivals for the status of the stewardship, if you like, of Socrates' legacy. Both Antisthenes and Plato, in their own way, were trying to say, I am the successor to the Socratic mantle. And what was it like to be in such spaces, the Academy and the Cynosarges? What kind of things do you see on the way to these spaces? What does the space itself feel like? What kind of sensory and emotional journey was it to achieve this sort of space? After all, space is not just physical. It has emotional and cognitive associations too. For example, one space next to another space, that gives it a certain meaning. You wouldn't necessarily want to go to a hospital that is next door to a crematorium, for example. You wouldn't necessarily like to buy a house next door to a shop selling reptiles, or a shop, you'd rather buy a house next to a shop selling soft furnishings than a house selling reptiles, for example. Such juxtapositions are strongly felt by users of civic space. It really matters what you are next to. So we need to start thinking about the associations that come to mind when people go to these spaces. Now, the city's three public gymnasia, the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Cynosarges, stood, as I've said, outside the Themistoclean walls. These are the Themistoclean walls of Athens. And up there, that's the road to the Academy. And down here, we have the Cynosarges. And here is the Lyceum. So you can see the relationship between the three gymnasia outside the city walls, and that is important. Now, the Academy lay 6 stades, about 1 kilometre northwest of the walls, as you left through the Dipylon Gate in the Kerameikos. Do I have that? No, this is the next one. The Lyceum and the Cynosarges were in the opposite direction, in the southeast, close to each other on the banks of the Ilissus. Now, what I've given you here is, in effect, a detail. So if you imagine that detail comes from that area down there. So you can see here is the Ilissus River. This is the Cynosarges here. That is the Lyceum. And this is, if anyone knows Athens, this is the temple of Olympian Zeus, which is such a dramatic figure on the landscape if you look down from the Acropolis. Now, if we can have a quick look at the Lyceum here. As I say, that I'm not going to be talking particularly about the Lyceum. The Lyceum has been well excavated in recent years. Unfortunately, the Cynosarges has not yet been found accurately, but we do know roughly where it was, so that approximation is enough for my purposes. As I say, I'm interested in not so much the physical location of these things in terms of exact topography, but more in the feel of these places, the associations. And I want to begin with Plato's Academy. Luckily, we have a guide to Plato's Academy. At the start of the 5th book of Cicero's De Finibus, he talks about a journey that he took in 79 to 78 BCE while he was studying in Athens. This is passage number 2 on the handout. What he writes is as follows. Once I had been attending the Ethics of Antiochus, a lecture of Antiochus, we know nothing about this particular lecture, with Marcus Piso, in a building called the School of Ptolemy, which is again unknown to us. And with us were my brother Quintus, Titus Pomponius, and Lucius Cicero, whom I loved as a brother, but who was really my first cousin. We arranged to take our afternoon stroll in the Academy, chiefly because the place would be quiet and deserted at that hour of the day. Accordingly, at the appointed time, we met at our rendezvous, Piso's lodgings, and started out beguiled with conversation on various subjects, the 3/4 of a mile from the Dipylon Gate. When we reached the walks of the Academy, which are so famously, deservedly famous, we had them entirely to ourselves, as we hoped. So we know something about what a walk to the Academy looked like, at least in the 1st century BCE. We know exactly where the Dipylon Gate is. In the aftermath of the Persian invasion of Greece, Athens built huge defensive walls that were completed in the 470s BCE, the so-called Themistoclean walls that I've mentioned earlier. an estimated 6.5 kilometers long, 8.8 to 10 meters tall, and 3 meters wide. Impressive things. Parts of these survive, and they survive best in the Keramaikos area, the ceramic quarter, the potter's quarter, in the northwest of the city, where there is now a nice archaeological site and the museum. The Dipylon was a massive fortified gateway and holding area that provided the main entrance to the city in that area. And it too lies in the Keramaikos archaeological site, and parts of it survive, which you have here. Literally, the Dipylon is a double gate with 2 chambers that could be sealed for defensive purposes. The road that Cicero took then was an identifiable road. We know about this road. And the road was known in antiquity as the Dromos. It was well paved. Bits of the paving actually survived. We'll see some of them soon. For benefit of people that were walking up to the academy. Now, this map helps us visualize what was going on here. So you have the Keramaikos area there, the Dipylon gate there, and this is the Dromos taking us up in the northwesterly direction towards the academy, which is somewhere on the roof up there. So here is the start of our journey. If you imagine you've just walked through the Dipylon gate, this is the journey that Cicero would have actually taken, although it wouldn't have been paved in concrete quite in that way. You then walk down the modern Plataeon Street, named after the Battle of Plataea, not after Plato. And on this map, so there's the beginning of Plataeon Street in the Keramaikos area, nice area. And then on the Google map, courtesy of our friends in Silicon Valley, it's a bit blurred here, I'm afraid, but you can see you're walking up this street here. You cross over a massive flyway here, and then you walk up Monasteriou Street there towards the academy. And we know this because, as I say, bits of the ancient wall have been, bits of the ancient road have been excavated. Here is a bit of it. Now, you may be thinking, okay, that's well and good for a pleasant afternoon stroll, a romantic recreation of Cicero's walk, but what does it tell us about anything? At this point, we need a different guide who will tell us what we find along the way along this walk, because, of course, at the moment, all this walk is, apart from little bits like this one here, all of this walk is under modern city, so we can't find out anything archaeologically. Luckily, we have a guide who tells us about the archaeology of this as he saw it. And this is, of course, Pausanias, who is antiquity's premier travel writer. He roamed about the Greek mainland in the 2nd century CE, describing what he encountered en route. Now, Pausanias is a better guide than Cicero to the topographic feel of the place, because he's interested in what we're interested in, the emotional texture of the landscape, in the juxtapositions between buildings and monuments, and their effects, whether they're consonant or dissonant. Pausanias' journey as a whole, in the 10 books of his description of Greece, is structured about the 3 great monumental sites. Athens occupies book 1, Olympia the middle books, and Delphi the final book. So Pausanias knows all about symbolic associations, symbolic juxtapositions. Now, Pausanias was writing half a millennium later than Plato, so we need to take that into account. And we know for sure that the built environment of Athens was very different in Pausanias' day. The Roman general Sulla had captured Athens in 87-6 and devastated its material fabric, including that of the Academy and the Dipylon area. This devastation, interestingly, occurred a mere 8 years before the walk that Cicero describes, and it's very striking that Cicero doesn't mention. He says, oh, it's very peaceful and calm, and there weren't many people around. There's a reason for that. His compatriot had been butchering Athenian citizens under 10 years previously. So when Cicero writes of craving solitudo at the site of the Academy, there is the most generous reading of that is to say that it's grimly ironic. By Pausanias' time, however, in the 2nd century CE, the Emperor Hadrian had invested a lot in the rebuilding of Athens, including, again, in the Dipylon area. There's a lot of Hadrianic building there, which survives in the archaeology now. But, of course, rebuilding doesn't mean restoration in its original state. Hadrian was reinventing the city as a monument to his own Philhellenism, and anyone who's been to Athens knows about the Arch of Hadrian, which divides the Roman city from the Greek city and so forth, but also reframes the view of the Roman city from the southeast. So we have to use Pausanias with care. He's not in any sense a straightforward witness to the city of the 4th century BCE. But with that preamble over, let's have a look to see what he says about what he finds when he leaves the Diplon Gate and walks outside the city towards the Academy, following in Cicero's footsteps. Here's handout number 3 on the passage number 3 on the handout. I haven't given you the whole of this passage, just a flavour of it. Outside the city too, and remember this is the walk that we're taking, Cicero's walk up the modern Plataeon street. Outside the city too, in the parishes and on the roads, the Athenians have sanctuaries of the gods and graves of heroes and men. The nearest is the Academy, once the property of a private individual, but in my time a gymnasium. Such, and then he describes a series of sanctuaries, such are the sanctuaries along the road, and of the graves, the first is that of Thrasybulus, son of Lycus, in all respects the greatest of all famous Athenians, whether they lived before him or after him. His is the first grave that you encounter as you leave the city, and after it there come those of Pericles, Chabrias, and Phormio. There is also a monument for all the Athenians whose fate it has been to fall in battle, whether at sea or on land, except such as those that fought at Marathon, who of course were buried on the battlefield itself. Those, for their valour, have the graves on the fields of the battle and so forth, and others lie along the road to the Academy, and on the graves stand slabs bearing the name and the deme of each of them. So many things to note about this passage, but I want to pick out 2 in particular. One is the heavy use of prepositions, exo, en, kata, each used in their literal, that's to say, real sense. He is describing the relationship between space in spaces and objects and monuments on this road. Pausanias is ever alert to the juxtapositions of real material objects, and the use of adverbs like engutato, the closest, and so forth. The proximity between things and the distance, these are very much in Pausanias' mind. He's describing a world in which meaning is generated by topographical relations, and indeed by temporal relations. I'm not going to be talking about that in particular, but he's very interested in the relationship between past and present and how the two interweave. Now, lots of sanctuaries here that I'm not going to be talking about, but it's the graves that I think are particularly important here. Pausanias is attentive to, as I say, the prepositional texture of space, the relational to what we might call the intensity and the variation, the juxtaposition of space. But the most important thing for our purposes is that the dromos, the road leading from the Kerameikos to the Academy, was full of markers of death and commemoration. Now, at one level, this is unsurprising. All roads in and out of Athens and in ancient cities generally tended to have graveside monuments, roadside grave monuments, because, of course, these are the most visible spaces for travellers in and out of the city. But the dromos was particularly important because of the emotive richness of the burials. We always talk, I mean, these are the prime burials. These are the places where the great heroes of Athenian history are buried. Even more importantly, because the dromos began in the Kerameikos, Athens' primary burial site, and a space associated symbolically with death and the original history of Athens. It's the birthplace of Eryxthonius. So the minute you start your journey on the dromos, most of your companions are underground. And again, we need to be thinking about this when Cicero takes his journey, and he says it's very quiet and peaceful. Well, there is a sort of grim echo there about the fact that this is a place full of the dead. The Kerameikos, the Potter's Quarter, was also the spot where, in the age of classical democracy, one of the civic leaders, most famously Pericles, would give an annual funeral speech celebrating those who died in war. Now, Pausanias shows us that these monuments to the dead continued right the way up to Plato's Academy itself, or at least to the Academy itself. Now, what does this have to do? I might actually just note one thing in passing. So there's the, these are slides from the Academy. That's the Academy, the actual gymnasium of the Academy. These are buildings that have been very tentatively associated with the buildings of Plato's Academy. We don't really know, but they may possibly be, but it's just interesting to see them. I've just given you another slide as well. As you walk up the the ancient dromos now in the modern city, you see lots of macabre images of death as well. I like to think that these are a little relic of, you know, the deathliness of the ancient site. And of course, modern Athenians know that the Kerameikos was the burial area of ancient Athens, because that's where the archaeological site is, and if they visited it, they will know that this area is associated with death. But what they've only, I don't know, guessed, I suppose, is that the deathliness of the dromos continued right the way up to the academy itself. Having said that, there is graffiti of this kind all over Athens, so I don't think it's particularly symbolically important. Mm-hmm. But as I say, I like to think that there is something still alive about the deathliness of the dromos in the modern street art of Athens. But what does this have to do with Plato's philosophy? Now let's turn to passage 4 on the handout, from Plato's Phaedo, the text, a relatively early text, in which Socrates breathes his last. This is Socrates' deathbed speech. Now, this is the classic statement of Platonic metaphysics, distinguishing the world of the body from that of the mind. The first half of the passage presents the body as an encumbrance, as something that weighs us down, that stops us from perceiving reality. It's the second part of the passage that particularly interests me. And then, he says, this is about halfway down in the passage, in the English, and then, as our argument shows, when we are dead, we're likely to possess the wisdom which we desire and claim to be enamored of, but not while we live. So we possess knowledge while we're dead. For if pure knowledge is impossible while the body is with us, one of two things must follow. Either it cannot be acquired at all, or only when we are dead. For only then will the soul be by itself apart from the body, but not before. So Plato's metaphysical position is that to obtain the proper object of our desire, phronesis, to see the truth, kathoran talethes, we must die, or rather the physical body must die, leaving the immortal soul free to contemplate unmolested. The aim of the philosophical life, then, is to get rid of the constraints of the material body, its appetites and desires, and focus instead on that immortal spark of divine fire that animates us. For Plato, death actually liberates the soul from the body, putting it in a state of greater philosophical purity. Now, the very journey up the dromos enacted this process, I think, symbolically. As you walked outside of the city, you were reminded endlessly of the transience and impermanence of the physical frame, of all those who'd gone before you, of how all that was left of them in our world were the memories of those who came after. So along the dromos, we get markers of death and the reminders of the frailty of the physical form. But as we get to the end of it, though, we reach a lush, well-watered spot by a river devoted to relaxation. The peacefulness that Cicero noted in the Academy could have another meaning. The Academy was a physical manifestation in the topography of Athens of the Platonic idea of death as the peaceful transcendence of the material body. Death is not the end, this journey tells us. Rather, it is the route to true philosophy. Now, let me just check the time. Okay, one short digression before we leave Plato. At some point, around 300 BCE, a rival philosopher, Epicurus, bought a plot of land and founded his famous garden. Now, the garden was not really a school like the Academy and or the Lyceum. It was more a physical manifestation of the idea of tranquil serenity at which his philosophy aimed, devoted to enabling friendship between people of all backgrounds, including women and slaves, and to the commemoration of Epicurus himself. Now, where Epicurus' garden was is not absolutely certain. There is no archaeology to help us here, and we're not even really sure what to look for in the archaeology. And again, as I say, much of Athens is still built over, so it's very hard to tell. But once again, Cicero comes to us, to our aid. In the passage that we've just looked at, just after that passage, we're told that once the party arrived at Athens, they entered into conversation, and his brother Quintus says that they only recently passed Epicurus' garden. So we know that Epicurus' garden was along the route. Now, where are we? So this is the modern city, and again, it's not, I'm afraid, a very clear map. Here's the Kerameikos here, and this is the route that we're following up towards the academy up there. So it's somewhere along that route, from between the Dipolon Gate and the academy, that Epicurus chooses to place his school. As I say, very hard to be certain. One modern Athenian told me that this is the site of Epicurus' garden. There's certainly a garden of sort. I think you'd find it hard to achieve a state of tranquil serenity and ataraxia with this massive road flying over the top. It's a very unserene place indeed. But it might be. There's, as I say, there's a little bit of greenery there that might reflect something of Epicurus' garden. But as I say, this is not the crucial point there. I'm not interested in where exactly it is in the modern city. I think the point is that Epicurus, just like Plato, chose a location that had symbolic associations. The Dromos was the road where, as I've said, Athenians thought collectively about death and commemoration. As we've seen, Plato's academy lay at the end of the Dromos as a reminder that death was not the end, that the decay of the physical body was the route to true tranquility. Now, Epicurus' garden was surely positioned so as to interrupt that story. Epicurus' garden was, rather than situating Epicurus' garden at the end of the Dromos, like Plato's, beyond death, Epicurus placed his philosophical school in the middle of that journey. So the garden was surrounded by monuments to the fallen. And this is interesting, it's fascinating actually, because death played an equally big role in Epicurean philosophy, but a very different role. One of Epicurus' central tenets is that the constituent parts of everything are matter and void. There is no spirit, there's no soul that will survive the afterlife. There is no afterlife and no judgment in the afterlife. And for Epicurus and his followers, this was said to be a source of great comfort. This life is the only one we have, so there's no need to worry about appeasing the gods and so forth. That the garden was located in a space thick with the material relics of the fragility of human life and remind us that nothing survives death from the Epicurean point of view is, of course, very powerfully symbolic. And Epicurus is deliberately setting himself against Plato, I think, by positioning his school there. It's almost as if he's a highwayman interrupting the journey up to the academy itself. He positioned his garden in a place that could have been seen as I say, deliberately anti-Platonic. Death leads nowhere for Epicurus, certainly not to some kind of idyllic afterlife, some sort of beyond. The only way in which we survive death is by being remembered by successors, by our friends in the afterlife. And that, I think, is why the garden, Epicurus located his garden in a forest of tombs. But back to our story. We're thinking about Plato. Why did Plato choose the academy as the location for his school? Well, I've given you one answer, which is that it's the, if you like, it represents the life beyond death. But there's another dimension to this, I think. Now, Plato was not the first philosopher to set up shop in a gymnasium. The first philosopher to do this in Athens was Antisthenes, who made the Cynosarges, which I mentioned right at the start, his own. So there's Plato's academy up there, and here's the Cynosarges down there, right on the other side of the city. Now, I think the fact that Plato located his school right on the other side of the city from Antisthenes is a very significant point. Plato wanted to be as far away from his rival as possible. He wanted to present his school as the absolute antithesis of Antisthenes'. Now, who was Antisthenes? Unlike Plato, he's left us very little in his own words, although we have numerous references to him. Amongst these are a number of fragments that attest to his closeness to Plato, but also his rivalry with him. The two are like a squabbling pair of twins, if you like. Here is a flavour, passage. I'm going to go to passage number 8 on the handout at this point over the page. He used to tease Plato with being conceited. At all events, when in a procession he spied a spirited charger, that's a horse, he said, turning to Plato, "It seems to me that you would have made just such a proud, showy steed." In other words, you're vain like a horse showing off and so forth. This, and I don't understand the following sentence at all, this was because Plato was constantly praising horse flesh As I say, no idea what's going on there. It seems to me that the joke is really that Plato is vain like a horse. And one day he visited Plato, who was ill, and seeing the basin into which Plato had vomited, he remarked, "The bile I see, but not the pride." And of course this is making jokes about the sort of the theories of the internal processes of human beings that, and the way in which they issue in emotions. Now, whatever the authenticity of anecdotes like this, whether Antisthenes actually said these words, they suggest that, at least in the minds of ancients, there was a strong sense that Plato and Antisthenes were rivals, that they were very similar people that were constantly dialoguing with each other, but close to each other, going round to each other's houses, but necessarily quarrelling with each other as well. So, as I say, that sense that the two were opposites, the two were doing a similar sort of thing, but on opposite sides of the city, I think is very significant for the location of these two schools. But why did Antisthenes choose the Cynosarges to teach in? Now here we are on very sure ground, because this particular gymnasium had a very strong set of associations in Athenian life. In 451-0, famously, Pericles enacted a citizenship law ensuring that only those who could claim Athenian parentage on both sides could be counted as Athenian. So up to that point, you could have an Athenian parent on one side, mother or father, and be an Athenian citizen. Now you needed both parents. This was the point at which their famous myth of autochthony gained its hold on the Athenian imagination. According to this story, the first Athenian, Erechtheus or Erechthonios, was born from the soil of Athens. The present-day Athenians, therefore, were the direct genetic descendants of the city's founder, a pure people with an unbroken link to the territory of Athens. Now, the myth of autochthony and the citizenship law have been widely discussed. I don't want to get into this in any great detail, but the important points are that on the one hand, what the Athenians are doing is distinguishing themselves from people like the Spartans. The Athenians are saying we are a pure race, unlike people like the Spartans who are incomers. They are eperludes is the Greek word, intruders into their land, or alternatively mixed race, megades, a word which is used by Athenians with a very negative connotation. And another effect of this law is that it led to a demonization of adultery, and in particular the demonization of sexually active women like Clytemnestra, of course, in Aeschylus' famous play, which is a little bit before this particular citizenship law. Finally, what this law did was created a new category of distinction in Athenian ideology between the legitimate and the bastards. Now, we need to think very sharply here. Normally, when we think about a bastard, we think about a bastard as somebody who is the child of unmarried parents, and that was an idea that persisted in Athenian culture. But there was an additional resonance. The bastards were, from now on, also people who were born of one Athenian and one non-Athenian parent, irrespective of whether the parents were married. Okay, so you could have married parents, one of whom was non-Athenian, and immediately, as a result of Pericles' citizenship law, those people became bastards. They were redefined as bastards at a stroke. Now, the reasons for Pericles' citizenship law have been widely debated, and they need not occupy us now. The important point was that the effect was to delegitimize many people and say, you are not Athenian citizens, you are now bastards. And this group included some pretty powerful people, for it was in fact the super rich who had the means to meet people outside the city and the will to forge strategic dynastic alliances with them, which may have been part of Pericles' motivation. He may have been trying to get these people out of the city. Now, the gymnasium at Cynosarges, this is where we come back to our story, was made over to the bastards. It was where the bastards exercised. We are told by one lexicographer of the 2nd century CE, Pausanias the Atticus, this is passage 5, sorry for going back on the handout, that the sanctuary was founded, the sanctuary of the Cynosarges was founded by Heracles, and we're told, as a result, the bastards, nothoi, are enrolled there, because Heracles too, though a bastard, was honoured as much as the gods. Now this depends on an idea that Heracles was a bastard because he was half human and half god, which is not a conventional definition of bastard. I mean, of course, in a sense, I suppose, all of Zeus's mortal children were bastards in the sense that Zeus wasn't married to any of the parents. But the point the point that's being pushed here is that Heracles is an extremely significant figure for the Cynosarges because he has a positive vision of bastardy. And this is something that comes in very clearly and very strongly in the 5th century, the association of the Cynosarges with the patron deity Heracles. But it's a way of saying that the bastards are not just delegitimized by Pericles' citizenship law. They have something positive and strong to give. Plutarch similarly tells us that Themistocles too used to exercise there because his mother was not Athenian, although there's something odd about this passage because Themistocles preceded the citizenship law. He preferred the gymnasium of Heracles, we're told, for he too was not a legitimate god, but had something alien about him from the fact that his mother was a mortal. So we're being told very strongly that the Cynosarges down here was a space associated with people who are not proper Athenian citizens. Now, to describe Heracles as a bastard may be a very strange thing to say, as I say, at one level, but we have very clear parallels for this identification from classical Athenian sources, like Aristophanes' birds. It seems absolutely clear that Heracles, of mixed divine and human parentage, was held up by the bastards of Cynosarges as a model for emulation. What they believed was that despite the disadvantages of birth, Heracles had triumphed through his fortitude and labor. So it wasn't birth, the situation of his birth, that made Heracles what it was what he did with his life. And this is the ideology, the prime ideology of the Cynosarges. Cynosarges was imagined as a place where the disadvantages of birth could be compensated for by virtuous behavior, which of course was a very warming, encouraging message to give to people that had been disenfranchised by Pericles' citizenship law. When you went to the Cynosarges area, you were going to a place of masculine striving and endeavor. You'd passed, so here we are, this is the slide I showed you earlier from the southeastern corner of Athens. You've come down this way, so that's the Lyceum up there. Here are the city walls coming down here. You pass the temple of Olympian Zeus here, unfinished in this era, in Plato's era, in Antisthenes' era, but it's a temple of Zeus, okay? Zeus the father. Then you come out, you cross the bridge here, cross the river, and you enter the zone of Heracles. So you go from the father Zeus, the zone of the father Zeus, to the zone of the bastard son Heracles. That's the feel of this particular environment. You could see the larger gymnasium complex of the Lyceum over there, but you were very aware that your own gymnasium complex was for you and for people like you, bastards. So you're now in a different zone of the city, overseen by Heracles, the bastard god who did everything, his father, Olympian Zeus, everything to make his father proud. Now, Antisthenes, who the founder of the school at the Cynosarges, was himself a bastard on his mother's side. This is passage number 6 on the handout. Antisthenes, the son of Antisthenes, was an Athenian. It was said, however, that he was not of pure Attic blood. Here was his reply to one who taunted him with this. The mother of the gods, too, is a Phrygian, because his mother was said to be a Phrygian. Hence, or a Thracian at least, hence it was that when he distinguished himself in the battle of Tanagra, he gave Socrates occasion to remark that if both his parents had been Athenians, he would not have turned out to be so brave. So again, a very important idea here, that being a bastard is actually something that makes you a better person. It gives you that spur to demonstrate virtue in your life. He himself showed his contempt for the airs which the Athenians gave themselves on the strength of being sprung from the soil. This is the myth of autochthony. Again, he said, nothing to do with that. Okay, that's useless. By the remark that this did not make them any better than snails or wingless locusts. Greeks apparently thought that locusts and snails were born from the earth, like the Athenians themselves. So, Antisthenes was not just a bastard, he was an active opponent of the Athenian ideology of good birth, the Athenian idea that being born an Athenian makes you a good person. The point of the final part that I quoted here is that it's better to be a bastard than to be an autochthonous Greek. And this is also the point about his virtuous behavior at the Battle of Tanagra. He fought more valiantly, Socrates said, than he would have done if he'd been a true-born Athenian. So virtue is different from circumstances of your birth. It's not what you are born as, but what you make of your life that demonstrates your virtue. Now, Antisthenes and his school made a great play of the idea of virtue, of arete, which they imagined as a form of moral fortitude displayed in the face of life's changing circumstances. It was, at one level, a metaphor drawn appropriately enough from the world of athletics. Certainly the word in Homer always has connotations of strength and vigor and manly heroism. And of course, the athletic association was particularly powerful in a gymnasium complex. But Antisthenes and his followers transferred the idea of arete as a physical virtue onto all areas of life so that it became a moral quality that anyone could display in any activity. In particular, it was a polemical concept in a double sense. Firstly, to display virtue, you needed something to fight against. You needed challenges in your life. This is why Antisthenes put so much emphasis on the idea of labor, on ponos, a property, of course, which was central to the idea of Heracles' own labors. Am I all right for time?
Yes.
Okay, 5 minutes?
A little bit more.
Yeah. Oh, okay, sure. Okay, so Antisthenes puts a lot of emphasis on the idea of labor, on ponos. And this is, of course, a property that is very closely associated with Heracles himself. Heracles overcomes labors, ponai, in his life. So that's one way in which the idea of arete is polemical. It's something that allows you to, if you like, conduct a war on life itself. But the idea of virtue was also polemical at a more abstract level because it was competing with a different idea, an Athenian idea of innate quality. The mainstream idea of good birth, eugeneia, was based around the idea of racial purity. The more Athenian you had in you, the more Athenian DNA, if you like, you had in you as a result of your parentage, the better you were as a person. Antisthenes' argument was precisely the opposite. Virtue, he insisted repeatedly, was teachable. This is passage number 9 on the handout. Favorite themes were, this is from Diogenes Laertius, who's summarizing these teachings of Antisthenes. Favorite themes with him were the following. He would prove that virtue can be taught, that nobility belongs to none other than the virtuous. Now, this theme comes first in Diogenes' list of the teachings of Antisthenes. Virtue is teachable. It's not an innate quality. It's something that you display and you learn about in the course of your life. It's not an abstract quality for Antisthenes, something that you possess inside you. It consists only in the habit of performing good deeds, and we are all capable of that, irrespective of the circumstances of our birth. And in fact, actually, the translation which I've given you here, which is taken from the Lerb edition, is misleading in the final sentence. What the Greek actually says is the possessors of virtue are identical to the eugenes, the noble or the well-born. So the enaretus, the people with arete in them, are the same as the eugenes, the well-born. Okay? So in other words, this is very pointed because the eugenes are what the Athenians call themselves. Noble because they imagine themselves to be the inheritors of a pure bloodline that gave them virtue. Antisthenes' Heraclean philosophy was designed first and foremost to resist that, to give a very different narrative to that. Now, when you left the city via the Diomean gate, which is our gate up here, that one there, so you're coming down from the city, the Acropolis area, down through this gate here, and you cross over the Ilissus, and you come into the Cynosarges area here, you enter a kind of para-Athens, an alternative space, a space that is like the city, but not like the city. And it has its own message, which is in dialogue with the Periclean message of Athenian good birth, Athenian eugeneia, but also the inversion of this. This is a place where moral qualities were displayed not through birth, but through practice and hard work, where the labor of philosophy was celebrated. Philosophy was about hard work and the display of virtue through the course of your life. Now, given all of this, it's no surprise whatsoever that Plato founded his school at the other end of Athens, the other extreme of Athens. Plato was an innatist. He believed that virtue was innate in us. He was an essentialist. His dialogue, Meno, is designed to prove precisely that virtue is intrinsic in the individual. It cannot be taught. Plato thought that even knowledge is inside us already, and is actually confused by being in the body. This world that we live in now doesn't, except in a very indirect way, doesn't allow us to display our virtue. There's no need for labours and trials within this world. In fact, in a sense, our primary duty is to prepare ourselves to escape from it. Now, I'm not arguing that the topography of Athens, explains all the dimensions of Greek philosophy in the 5th and 4th centuries. Of course not. This is not an argument in favour of the determinism, if you like, of reality. But I do think, however, that whatever Plato might assert, Plato claims that reality is an illusion and so forth, that Athenian philosophy was lived in real space. And like all forms of cultural production, it was enacted in real space and it was expected to be experienced in real space. Most people in this period encountered philosophy not in books, but in physical settings expounded by real people that understood to their very core what the spaces of Athens meant, how they signified, and how they resonated. Understanding how the city of Athens was laid out, its textures, its intensities, helps us to appreciate better the feel of the different philosophies and their complex interrelationships with each other. It also helps, I hope, to further the project of what I've called heretical empiricism within classics, to help us understand how we can reclaim text from abstractions and so forth, and reperceive the rich reality that animated them in antiquity. Muchas gracias.
Tenemos, creo que tiempo para una pregunta. Si no, si prefieren, se la pueden pasar a Tim después. ¿Alguno de los? Yes. Por favor, si podemos esperar a que hagan la pregunta los compañeros.
Question about Cicero's work.
Yes, yeah.
And I was wondering if that can help us maybe not just understand the way philosophy in Athens worked better, but also how the Romans positioned themselves against that philosophy. Like, do you think that maybe Cicero not mentioning that there are all of these ways is intentional, right? Like he is telling you, look, there are graves, but I'm not going to mention them. He's saying, oh, it's so quiet here. You know the graves, but I'm not going to spell it out for you. And Piso, who makes these observations about the buildings and the memories they evoke, he also talks of one Roman building, the Curia, right, which is deliberately within the city. And he talks about all of these senatorial politicians that are being evoked by the side of the Curia. So I wonder if that passage also contains a response. Okay, but while the Athenians, they're all really concerned with death and what comes afterwards, we focus sort of on the present and on politics and good governance.
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating. I mean, one other thing to feed into that is, of course, as I mentioned in the paper, that Sulla had destroyed much of this area as well. So, and rebuilt the Curia. Yes, that's right. Another thing to throw in there is that the topography of the walk that Cicero describes starts off in this school of Ptolemy, which again is sort of post-classical, I mean Hellenistic, but post-classical as well. So I'm sure you're right that what Cicero is doing is reimagining this place as Romanized, not quite yet Romanized in the way that Hadrian utterly reframed and rebuilt the city, but certainly, yes, part of that process of reimagining the city. One final thing to add in there, of course, is that Cicero's own relationship with Platonism is very interesting. The Skeptical Academy is itself an utter rewriting of, and a sort of palimpsestic version of Plato's Academy, and a different version of Socratic aporetic thought. So in all these ways, yes, I'm sure you're absolutely right that this is an eminently Roman vision of that walk up through the city, and extremely layered and very complex on Cicero's own part. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias otra vez a Tim por estar aquí con nosotros.